Okay, guys, this is part 2 to today. Usually we're able to read it in one setting, but because this chapter is a little lengthy, it only gave me so much space on my phone, so I'm going to have to upload it as like part 1, part 2, but I am going to continue reading. So if you missed part 1 for today's video for the words of affirmation, feel free to check it out. Okay, so once inside, however, I discovered the truth. Their marriage was in shambles. 12 years and 2 children after the wedding day, they wondered why they had married in the first place. They seemed to disagree on everything. The only thing they really agreed on was that they both loved the children. As the story unfolded, my observation was that Mark was a workaholic who had little time left over for Andrea. Andrea worked part-time, mainly to get out of the house. Their method of coping was withdrawal. They tried to put distance between themselves so that their conflicts would not seem as large, but the gauge on both love tanks read empty. They told me, guys, that they had been going for marriage counseling but didn't seem to be making much progress. They were attending my marriage seminar and I was leaving town the next day. This would likely be my only encounter with them, so I decided to put everything on the table. I spent an hour with each of them separately. I listened intently to both stories. I discovered that in spite of the emptiness of their relationship and their many disagreements, they appreciated certain things about each other. Mark acknowledged Andrea was a good mother, but he continued, "There is simply no affection coming from her. I work my tail off and she doesn't appreciate it." In my conversation with Andrea, she agreed that Mark was an excellent provider, but she complained, "He does nothing around the house to help me, and he never has time for me. What's the use of having nice things if you don't ever get to enjoy them together?" With that information, guys, I decided to focus my advice by making only one suggestion to each of them. I told Mark and Andrea separately that each one held the key to changing the emotional climate of the marriage. That key, I said, is to express verbal appreciation for the things you like about the other person, and for the moment, suspending your complaints about the things you do not like. We reviewed the positive comments they had already made about each other, and I helped each of them write a list of those positive traits. Mark's list focused on Andrea's activities with her children, home, and church. Andrea's list focused on Mark's hard work and financial provision of the family. We made the list as specific as possible. Andrea's list looked like this. He is aggressive in his work. He has received several promotions through the years. He's a good financial manager. He is always thinking of ways to improve his productivity. He's generous with finances and agrees I can use the money from my job any way I desire. Mark's list looked like this. She keeps our house clean and orderly. She helps the kids with their homework. She cooks dinner about 3 days a week. She teaches first grade Sunday school. She chauffeurs the children to all their activities. I suggested that they add to the list things they notice in the weeks ahead. I also suggested that twice a week they select one positive trait and express verbal appreciation for it to the spouse. I gave one further guideline. I told Andrea that if Mark happened to give her a compliment, she was not to give him a compliment at the same time, but rather she should simply receive it and say, "Thank you for saying that." I told Mark the same thing. I encouraged him to do that every week for 2 months. And if they found it helpful, they could continue. If the experiment did not help the emotional climate of the marriage, then they could write it off as another failed attempt. The next day, I got on the plane and returned home. I made a note to follow up with them 2 months later to see what had happened. When I called them in midsummer, I asked to speak to each of them individually. I was amazed to find that Mark's attitude had taken a giant step forward. He had guessed that I had given Andrea the same advice I had given him, but that was all right. He loved it. She was expressing appreciation for his hard work and his provision for the family. She has actually made me feel like a man again. We've got a ways to go, Dr. Chapman, but I really believe we are on the road. When I talked to Andrea, however, I found that she had only taken a baby step forward. She said, "It has improved some Excuse me, guys, Dr. Chapman. Mark is giving me verbal compliments as you suggested, and I guess he is sincere. But he's still not spending any time with me. He's still so busy at work that we never have time together. As I listened to Andrea, I knew that I had made a significant discovery. The love language of one person is not necessarily the love language of another. It was obvious that Mark's primary love language was words of affirmation. He was a hard worker and he enjoyed his work, but what he wanted most from his wife was expressions of appreciation for his work. That pattern was probably set in childhood, and the need for verbal affirmation was no less important in his adult life. Andrea, on the other hand, was emotionally crying out for something else. That brings us to love language number 2, which we're going to talk about that tomorrow, Lord's will. And it says, your turn. What would you most like to hear your spouse say to you? And tomorrow morning, we're going to jump into chapter 5, which is love language number 2, quality time. So far, we did acknowledgments. I went over the contents, what happens to love after the wedding, keeping the love tank full, falling in love, love language number 1, words of affirmation. And tomorrow, we'll pick up love language number 2, quality time.